You'd think after living through 3 hurricanes, people around here would know better than to mess with insurance. But if there's one universal truth I've learned from dealing with HOAKaren types, it's this. The louder they are about the rules, the less they understand about real life. And Linda, our HOA president, was no exception. It all started when I moved into this neighborhood 4 years ago. It was one of those neatly trimmed picket fence communities you see advertised with words like tranquil, safe, and prestigious. I bought my home cash, no mortgage. I'm a veteran, retired Navy, and I've worked hard enough to enjoy my peace. My wife and I picked this suburb specifically because we thought it would be quiet, easy, predictable. But predictable isn't what we got. No sooner had we moved in than I met Linda, 60-something, power walking at exactly 6 a.m. every morning with a whistle, a clipboard, and a glare that could sour milk. She introduced herself not with a handshake, but with a warning. We take our rules seriously here. I hope you're the type who respect authority. That's how it always starts with HOA Karens. Not a welcome, but a challenge. Still, I kept my head down. I paid my dues. I mowed my lawn precisely as they required. I painted my shutters regulation beige. I even attended the HOA meetings, if only to keep track of what new nonsense Linda and her cronies were cooking up next. The clubhouse was the center of their little kingdom. A gaudy, oversized building with fake columns and a rental hall they used for HOA meetings and an occasional overpriced community event. Linda treated it like her personal castle. She'd boast about how well managed the HOA funds were, about how she'd saved everyone thousands by cutting corners on unnecessary expenses. Unnecessary expenses like insurance. That's right. In a hurricane-prone state, this woman had convinced the HOA board to let the insurance policy on the clubhouse lapse because the rates had gone up too high to justify. Her words, "We're not going to throw money away on something that isn't going to happen." And because no one dared challenge her, because everyone was too intimidated by the threat of fines, violations, or passive-aggressive neighborly retaliation, no one spoke up, except me. At one particular HOA meeting about a year before the storm, I raised my hand and said point blank, "You're gambling with people's property. This is Florida. It's not a matter of if a storm comes through. It's when." Linda smiled that thin, condescending smile of hers. "You're new here. We've been through this before. I've been running this HOA for 15 years. We've never had a problem. I've been through storms too." I told her, "The Navy doesn't prepare for probably not. We prepare for the worst because that's how you protect what matters." She laughed, and said, "Well, this isn't the Navy. It's a private community, and I'm confident in my leadership." Her little circle of minions nodded along like bobbleheads. After that meeting, my wife and I talked seriously about whether this was the kind of neighborhood we wanted to stay in long term. But selling a house isn't like breaking a lease. And besides, I'm not the kind of man who lets bullies chase me off my own property. So we stayed. The months passed. Linda continued her reign of petty citations and passive-aggressive newsletters. She fined a woman down the block $50 for having unauthorized garden gnomes. She scolded a retired veteran for flying a flag that was too large for the front porch. All the while, she bragged about how much money the HOA was saving. No insurance. No backup plan. Then came the storm. It wasn't even the biggest one on record, but it didn't need to be. A fast-moving Category 2 barreling inland with wind gusts over 100 miles per hour. The kind of storm where you don't sleep. You just sit and listen, waiting to see what's left when the sun comes up. Our house was solid. I had prepped it well. Storm shutters, reinforced doors, a generator at the ready. The next morning, our street looked like a war zone. Trees down, power lines snapped, fences flattened, and the clubhouse? Gone. Flattened. The storm peeled back the roof like a sardine can, collapsed the front facade, and reduced the prestigious rental hall to a soggy mess of drywall and debris. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. Within days, contractors showed up, called by Linda in a panic. She marched around the wreckage in her visor and windbreaker, barking orders, demanding quotes, trying to act like she still had authority. Then came the moment of truth. No insurance. No coverage, no payout, just a cold, hard reality of rebuilding on HOA funds, and the furious realization from every homeowner that their dues have been wasted on years of landscaping and clubhouse decorations, not protection. The meeting after the storm was packed. For the first time since I moved in, people who've been too afraid to speak up finally found their voices. Homeowners demanded answers. Where had the money gone? Why had Linda let the policy lapse? What was she thinking? Linda tried to spin it. No one could predicted this. We're victims of climate change. Bad luck. I stood up. No, we're victims of arrogance. I warned you. You laughed at me. You gambled with our money and you lost. The room exploded in agreement. Neighbors who'd never made eye contact with me were suddenly shaking my hand. That's when the news spread further. Without insurance, the HOA's legal responsibility fell back on homeowners. Special assessments, emergency fees, potential lawsuits. People were furious. Resignations followed. Linda tried to cling to power, blaming miscommunication, but no one was buying it. By the time FEMA arrived to assess the damage, she was a pariah. The irony? FEMA wasn't there for the clubhouse. They were there because enough homes had been damaged that the area qualified for federal assistance. But the clubhouse? That was on the HOA. And without insurance, it was on Linda's shoulders. Neighbors started talking about lawsuits, about fraud, about negligence. For the first time in her reign, Linda looked afraid. Because the storm hadn't just flattened her clubhouse. It had flattened her reputation, her power, her legacy. And as I sat back, watching it all unfold, I couldn't help but think, nature doesn't care about your titles, your fines, or your little rules. Nature always gets the last word. If you thought Linda would take responsibility like a normal, reasonable adult after the storm flattened her precious clubhouse, you don't understand the breed of creature known as HOAKaren. For people like Linda, accountability is as foreign as humility. She didn't back down. She doubled down. In the days immediately following the storm, there was chaos throughout the neighborhood. Insurance adjusters were everywhere, assessing homes, inspecting roofs, dealing with water damage. FEMA set up temporary assessment stations for emergency relief. Neighbors checked on neighbors. The community pulled together, except for Linda. Linda wasn't offering help. Linda was trying to salvage her reputation. It started with an email. Subject line, HOA update, moving forward with strength. In this masterpiece of self-delusion, Linda painted herself as a victim of unprecedented circumstances, claiming no one could have foreseen this once-in-a-century storm. She mentioned FEMA, mentioned disaster declarations, and vaguely hinted that the HOA would lead the recovery effort with resolve and courage. Not a single mention of the fact that she canceled the insurance coverage herself, nor the fact that rebuilding the clubhouse would now financially cripple the HOA and its residents. Instead, she wrote, "We ask for patience and understanding as we navigate this together. Strong leadership will see us through this adversity." Patience? Understanding? From neighbors staring down $10,000 special assessments just to fund a rebuild none of them had asked for? But Linda wasn't finished embarrassing herself. At the first post-storm HOA meeting, held awkwardly in a borrowed church basement since the clubhouse was a pile of splinters, Linda strutted in like nothing had happened. Clipboard, matching visor and windbreaker, that same self-satisfied smirk. But this time, something had changed. The homeowners weren't silent anymore. The meeting opened with Linda's tone-deaf monologue about unity in the face of tragedy, and how the HOA board was exploring options for fundraising efforts and potential emergency loans to restore community facilities. She used words like revitalize and rebirth, as if this were some grand community journey, rather than the result of her catastrophic mismanagement. Then I stood up. "Are you going to tell everyone about the insurance, Linda?" I asked loudly enough that the entire room turned. Linda's smile faltered. "We're currently exploring all avenues to ensure the HOA stability." "Answer the question," I pressed. "Did you or did you not cancel the insurance policy last year?" A murmur rippled through the room. People leaned forward. This wasn't on the agenda, but now it was the only thing anyone cared about. Linda bristled. The board agreed. "Did you?" I said again, slow and clear. Personally recommend and push through the decision to cancel the clubhouse insurance because you thought it was too expensive? She tried to pivot. Financial prudence. Yes or no, Linda? Her lips tightened. Yes. There it was. Out loud. On record. For the first time, she couldn't weasel her way out with corporate speak or HOA jargon. Gasps. Audible anger. Someone even clapped sarcastically from the back row. And did you inform homeowners clearly in writing that we were uninsured? That's when she panicked. It was in the meeting notes. People were notified. Show us where, someone shouted. Prove it, someone else added. The room erupted into voices. Angry, frustrated, tired of the lies. People pulled out their phones, flipping through old HOA emails, newsletters, anything that would prove Linda had hidden this decision from the people now footing the bill. Of course, there was nothing. No formal notice. No clear announcement. Just a buried footnote in one meeting's minutes about adjusting community operating expenses to account for rising premiums. Vague enough to cover herself legally, she thought. But not anymore. Neighbors who'd never spoken up before were now emboldened. A retired CPA stood up and declared he'd be auditing the HOA's finances. A lawyer from 2 Streets over-volunteered to review the HOA's liability exposure pro bono. Homeowners began organizing outside the meeting, forming alliances, talking about recalls, replacements, and legal action. Linda realized too late that the tide had turned. But even then, she refused to go quietly. A week later, another email arrived. This time the subject was Special Assessment for Clubhouse Restoration. Attached. A breakdown of costs, hundreds of thousands in construction, permits, landscaping, inspections, all to restore her pet project. Divided among homeowners. A $12,000 per household emergency assessment. Payable in full within 90 days. People lost their minds. I heard about one neighbor who marched straight to Linda's house and threatened legal action on the spot. Another neighbor started a petition for a vote of no confidence. HOA Facebook groups exploded with screenshots, rants, and demands for immediate leadership change. Linda responded with threats of liens. Failure to comply with HOA assessments may result in foreclosure proceedings, she warned, leaning on her only remaining power. But this wasn't a late trash can citation or a lawn height violation. This was tens of thousands of dollars. This was people's homes and livelihoods. Linda had underestimated the very people she thought she controlled. One night, about a month after the storm, I got a knock on my door. It was Jim, the neighbor who flew the too big flag Linda had once fined. He handed me a manila envelope. Thought you might want to see this, he said with a grin. Inside, copies of HOA board meeting recordings, emails, and financial statements. Documents proving Linda had manipulated the board, pressured votes, hidden decisions, and misrepresented funds. Enough, Jim thought, for legal grounds to sue, not just for negligence, but potentially for fraud. Jim wasn't the only one collecting receipts. Within days, homeowners were lawyering up. They called emergency meetings. They filed for a full audit. They brought in outside HOA management firms for advice. What Linda had tried to bury under bluster and bureaucracy was now out in the open, dissected in group chats and town halls. Meanwhile, FEMA finalized its assessments. While individual homeowners would receive relief, FEMA made it clear the destroyed clubhouse was the HOA's responsibility. FEMA doesn't cover bad management decisions. FEMA doesn't bail out arrogance. Linda, once untouchable, was now cornered, facing lawsuits, potential criminal charges, and a community ready to dismantle her empire brick by brick. But she wasn't done scheming yet. Word spread that she'd quietly contacted a developer friend, someone with interest in buying up lots and turning the remains of the clubhouse site into condos. A deal that would enrich her, erase the clubhouse from existence, and leave the neighborhood permanently altered. But this time, she wasn't moving in secret. This time, we were watching, and we were ready. Linda had ruled our HOA with fear, fines, and fake confidence for so long that she truly believed nothing could topple her. Not even the storm. Not even FEMA breathing down her neck. She thought she could sweep the mess under the rug like she always had. with another newsletter, another emergency meeting, another round of smug apologies wrapped in legal jargon. But something had changed in the neighborhood, and this time, people weren't going to let her get away with it. For weeks after the storm, as blue tarp spread over rooftops and neighbors helped each other clear fallen branches, whispers started traveling faster than the cleanup crews. People who never used to speak to each other were suddenly exchanging stories, piecing together just how reckless Linda's decisions had been. And at the center of it, the fact she had knowingly let the insurance lapse. A neighbor down the street, a soft-spoken woman named Carol, confided in me one afternoon while we cleaned up her front yard together. She told me at the last HOA meeting not to bring it up anymore because it would cause panic. That was just 2 months before the storm hit. Carol shook her head, anger simmering beneath her usual politeness. She knew this could happen. I wasn't surprised, but it gave me an idea. See, Linda had built her power on isolation. Keep people afraid of rocking the boat. Keep them scared of fines. Keep them compliant. Alone, a homeowner had no power against her. But together, we were the HOA, not her. That's when I started organizing. Quietly at first, backyard barbecues turned into strategy sessions. Casual coffee chats became unofficial planning meetings. People brought receipts, emails, newsletters, anything that proved Linda had been warned, had ignored advice, had gambled our collective funds. It turned out I wasn't the only one who had raised concerns about insurance over the years. At least 4 neighbors had done the same, and Linda had shut each of them down with the same arrogance she'd shown me. One neighbor, Mark, even had audio recordings from a meeting where Linda said, "Insurance companies are just trying to scare us. We're smarter than that." Smarter? Right. With evidence stacking up, we reached out to a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He was more than happy to review our case. His reaction? She's toast. Legally, the HOA board had fiduciary responsibility to protect community assets. Negligence, especially something as blatant as letting the only policy lapse, opened the door for lawsuits, and not just from homeowners, vendors, contractors, even the county, if cleanup costs touched public resources. But we weren't looking for money. Not yet. We wanted accountability. The attorney drafted a formal demand for Linda's immediate resignation. Failure to comply would result in legal action on behalf of the homeowners, seeking restitution for the damages caused by her negligence. Attached to the letter, every scrap of evidence we'd gathered. Emails, recordings, witness statements, proof of warnings ignored. We planned to present it publicly at the next HOA meeting. And that's where things got deliciously ironic. Linda, desperate to maintain the illusion of control, had called a special meeting to address the storm recovery plan. She expected to walk in, hand out a few staged apologies, and spit herself as a hero steering us through this mess. Instead, she walked into a packed clubhouse, or what was left of it, a room full of angry, organized neighbors with copies of the resignation letter already in hand. When she tried to launch into her rehearsed speech about acts of God and unforeseeable challenges, I stood up, calm, clear, direct. "Linda, before you waste any more of our time, I suggest you read this." I handed her the letter. Every eye in the room watched as her face went pale, then red, then something between fury and fear. She tried to dismiss it, said we didn't have the authority. That's when the attorney stood up from the back of the room. "Actually, they do." You could have heard a pin drop. He explained, for the benefit of everyone present, how the HOA bylaws gave homeowners the power to call for a vote of no confidence. How Linda's negligence wasn't just embarrassing, it was legally actionable. And how, with sufficient cause and evidence, we could remove her and pursue damages. Linda blustered. She ranted. She accused us of conspiring against her, of twisting her words, of manufacturing outrage. But no one was listening anymore. They were listening to each other, to the evidence, to common sense. Neighbors who had been silent for years spoke up about fines they'd paid, intimidation they'd faced, warnings they'd received for things as petty as mailbox colors or lawn decorations. It all painted the same picture, a woman drunk on petty power, now facing the reality of consequences. When the attorney finished, He asked one simple question: "Shall we vote?" Unanimous. Linda was removed on the spot. Her minions on the board tried to object, but without her, they had no spine left. Within minutes, a new interim board was nominated. People who actually lived here, who actually cared about rebuilding, not ruling. Linda left the clubhouse with her clipboard tucked under one arm. Her reputation in tatters. The woman who once strutted these streets like a queen was now just another neighbor, one facing potential lawsuits and financial ruin. And me? I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The storm had already done the heavy lifting. But the best part? We weren't done yet. The new board's first act was to reinstate proper insurance, contact FEMA for full assessments, and begin negotiations with contractors, this time with oversight and transparency. Their second act? Audit the HOA finances. Fully, publicly. Rumors swirled that Linda hadn't just neglected insurance. She'd been funneling funds into vanity projects and consulting fees. If true, she wouldn't just be facing lawsuits. She'd be facing criminal charges. For years, she had built her little empire on fear and silence. Now, the silence was broken. The neighborhood had found its voice. And Linda? She was about to learn what it feels like when the people you tried control finally take control back. When FEMA's assessment officially came through, things shifted from bad to catastrophic for Linda and the HOA board. It turned out the clubhouse damage wasn't even the worst of it. Stormwater runoff had caused major erosion beneath the parking lot foundation, creating a dangerous sinkhole risk that would require not just repairs, but massive excavation work. FEMA's representative didn't mince words. This structure should have been covered under commercial liability insurance. Without it, the responsibility falls squarely on the HOA's shoulders. No exceptions. Linda, red-faced and trembling behind her trademark clipboard, tried to negotiate. She argued that surely FEMA had some provision for misunderstandings. The FEMA rep calmly explained that FEMA is not in the business of rescuing negligent HOAs from their own arrogance. The community meeting called after that was unlike any I'd ever seen. This wasn't the usual sparse crowd of retirees and rule followers nodding politely while Linda rattled off her reports. No, this time the room was packed. Angry homeowners stood shoulder to shoulder, waving notices about impending special assessments. Some had already received estimates, several $1,000s per household, effective immediately, to cover the uninsured damages. People who had paid their dues faithfully for years were now being told they'd have to cough up more because Linda decided insurance was unnecessary. I stayed quiet for most of that meeting. I didn't need to say much. The room's energy spoke volumes. Homeowners who'd never challenged the board before were now openly demanding resignations. A former treasurer stood up and announced that Linda had ignored not just FEMA's recommendations from years prior, but multiple warnings from the HOA's own accountant. She let the policy lapse to keep our dues artificially low, he said. That's fraud. Plain and simple. Linda tried to fight back. We voted on this, she insisted. The board approved my decision. The majority was in favor. But that wasn't true, and everyone knew it. What Linda meant was that her hand-picked friends on the board rubber-stamped whatever she wanted. No proper vote had ever been taken among the homeowners. No disclosure had been made about the risk they were assuming. Someone even produced an old newsletter where Linda had boasted about streamlining unnecessary expenses, but conveniently omitted any mention of insurance. The dam had broken. One by one, neighbors stood up and told their stories. The veteran fined for his flag. The single mom cited over a misplaced trash bin. The elderly couple bullied into painting their house 3 times because Linda didn't like the shade of taupe. People who'd stayed silent for years were now loudly and publicly shaming the woman who had terrorized them over meaningless violations while ignoring real responsibilities. And then came the final nail. One homeowner, a quiet woman I barely knew, but who'd apparently been a legal secretary for decades, stood up with a file folder in hand. I've reviewed the HOA bylaws, she said calmly. Section 14C states that any board member who engages in gross negligence resulting in financial harm to the HOA may be held personally liable. I'm not a lawyer, but I've spoken to 2 already, and I'm prepared to bring this to court." Linda paled. Her carefully constructed world, the power, the deference, the illusion of control, was crumbling in front of her. You could almost see her calculating whether she could bluff her way out of this too. But the murmurs spreading through the room told her the answer. Someone shouted, "Resign or we'll sue." Another, "Pay up, Linda. This is your mess." It was poetic justice watching her squirm. All the years she'd spent lording over people with her clipboard and citations, undone by her own arrogance. She had assumed no one would ever challenge her, that her little empire fear would last forever. But bullies always crumble when the consequences finally catch up. Linda resigned that night, effective immediately. Her cronies on the board followed within days. An interim committee was formed, this time made up of people who actually cared about transparency and responsibility. One of their first acts? Filing a claim against Linda's personal assets for negligence. Apparently, she hadn't thought to get liability insurance for herself either. Poetic. Cleanup began slowly. FEMA grants helped with the broader neighborhood issues, roads, drainage, utilities. But the clubhouse? That was auctioned off as is, sold to a developer who planned to bulldoze what remained and turn the space into a public park. In the end, Linda's legacy wasn't a prestigious clubhouse, but an empty lot marked by caution tape. As for me, I stayed, not out of spite, but because I bought this home to build a life. And thanks to Linda's downfall, the neighborhood finally started acting like a real community. Neighbors who'd barely spoken now held block parties. The new board encouraged feedback, transparency, and yes, mandatory insurance policies. Sometimes it takes a storm to wash out the rot. And Linda? Word had it she moved in with her sister across town. No HOA power, no clubhouse throne. Just a bitter old woman watching the world move on without her. And every time the wind picked up, I wondered if she thought back to the days she laughed at me about insurance and realized how wrong she'd been. Linda wasn't just in trouble. She was cornered. Within weeks of the storm flattening the clubhouse, FEMA had completed its preliminary assessments. While the agency would step in to assist homeowners whose primary residences had suffered storm damage, the HOA clubhouse wasn't eligible for any government support. Why? Because Linda, in all her penny-pinching brilliance, had officially declared it non-essential infrastructure in last year's HOA filings, just to save a few bucks on taxes. The clubhouse wasn't insured. It wasn't protected. It wasn't even technically necessary, according to the HOA's own records. Linda had gambled on a hurricane not arriving. Linda had gambled on no one noticing. Linda had lost. What followed was a slow, painful unraveling of her carefully built suburban fiefdom. The HOA board, one stack of her obedient yes-men, began to fracture. Members who had previously been afraid to speak up now found their courage. Fueled by angry homeowners who realized their HOA fees were about to skyrocket to cover the costs of rebuilding. Emergency assessments weren't hypothetical anymore. They were real, thousands of dollars per home. Potentially, the neighborhood was furious, not inconvenienced, not annoyed, furious. At the next HOA meeting, the first one held not in the clubhouse, which now resembled a war zone, but in a temporary tent provided by a neighbor, Linda attempted damage control. She blamed the insurance companies. She blamed climate change. She blamed unprecedented weather patterns. She never blamed herself. "I did what I thought was best for this community," she insisted, her voice trembling as she stood before rows of folding chairs filled with angry, exhausted faces. No one could have predicted this. Wrong again. I raised my hand. People actually stepped aside so I could stand. You didn't predict it because you didn't listen. I warned you. Others warned you. You chose to ignore us. You chose to leave this neighborhood exposed. And now we're paying for your arrogance. The crowd murmured in agreement. One neighbor, a soft-spoken woman whose roof had caved in during the storm, stood up too. "Why should we trust you to lead anything after this? You gamble with our money. You gamble with our homes." Linda's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand how hard this job is. I volunteered for this HOA for 15 years. Someone in the back shouted, "And you're done now." Applause broke out. Not polite applause. Relieved applause. The kind people give when a villain finally exits stage left. That night, Linda resigned. Not with grace. Not with dignity. But with bitterness. She stormed out of the tent, shouting something about ungrateful neighbors and doing everything by the book. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who'd built her power on the HOA rulebook was now being undone by the same community she thought she controlled. But here's where it gets truly poetic. In the weeks that followed, the new, temporary HOA board, now led by level-headed, reasonable neighbors, began auditing the HOA's finances. What they found was worse than expected. Linda hadn't just neglected to pay for insurance. She'd redirected funds, landscaping fees, clubhouse maintenance budgets, reserve funds, all siphoned into a discretionary account labeled Community Engagement Initiatives. On paper, it looked legitimate. In practice, it funded Linda's little vanity projects, catered HOA brunches, expensive signage no one asked for, even partial payments toward the HOA's own attorney to protect herself from prior complaints. Worse yet, some of the vendors she claimed to have hired didn't exist. It wasn't theft, exactly. It was gross mismanagement hidden under layers of HOA bureaucracy. Enough that the board could file formal complaints. Enough that the homeowners could sue. Enough to bring in state-level HOA oversight. Linda, once the queen of suburban order, now found herself facing an investigation, legal threats, and public humiliation. Neighbors began to circulate memes of the flattened clubhouse with captions like, "Should have bought the policy, Linda." Even the local news picked up the story. Storm exposes HOA negligence in small suburban community. They interviewed homeowners, but Linda refused to appear on camera. She wasn't answering the door anymore. Her once perfect lawn grew weeds. Her prized Neighborhood of the Year signs were quietly removed. By the time FEMA closed its files and homeowners got their individual claims sorted, Linda had sold her house in a quiet rush sale. Rumor had it she moved to a condo in another county, somewhere with no HOA, somewhere she thought no one would recognize her. But people talk, and when a former HOA Karen tries to join another neighborhood, word travels faster than any storm. The neighborhood, meanwhile, recovered slowly. With a new board came smarter decisions, reinstating proper insurance policies, hiring professional auditors, and establishing clear transparency for every homeowner. The clubhouse was eventually demolished, the land repurposed as a storm shelter area, complete with FEMA-approved reinforcements. Funny how priorities change once the right people are in charge. Neighbors began to wave to each other more. Fewer passive-aggressive letters, more open communication. The Karen era of the HOA became something we joked about at block parties. Remember when Linda said insurance wasn't necessary? Remember when Linda said nothing bad ever happens here? Remember when Linda said we should just trust her? Yeah, we remembered, but we moved forward. As for me, I took quiet satisfaction in knowing that I hadn't just watched karma unfold. I'd helped push it along. Not with revenge, not directly, but by standing up, speaking out, refusing to let arrogance go unchecked. The storm did the heavy lifting. Nature reminded everyone who's really in charge. Funny thing is, I saw Linda one more time, months later, grocery store parking lot. She looked smaller somehow, not just older, but defeated. She recognized me. I could see it in her eyes. We didn't speak. But as she climbed into her car, a battered old sedan, not the HOA-funded SUV she once flaunted, I thought about saying something. Not "I told you so." Not "you got what you deserved." Just this: insurance isn't for cowards. It's for the prepared. But I didn't say it. Her face said enough.